Okay, we are now live. I'm also going to start the recording. And turning things over to Margot.
So good evening, and I have to admit this is the first time I've done a talk by Zoom. I've participated in lots of meetings, but it's the first time. I'm used to really loving to interact with everyone, so it's a little different for me. For those of you that don't know me, I am the director of the Cavendish Historical Society, but I have a long background in healthcare. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland originally, and my undergraduate degree is in experimental psych, and my graduate work was in epidemiology, the study of disease, so I have a huge amount of experience in research. I've had a long career in healthcare, and I've worked on, I was very much on the front lines of the AIDS epidemic, and I'm on our town's COVID committee. I also run Cavendish Connects, so I'm very aware of, through Cavendish Facebook, how this epidemic and pandemic is impacting people. And on top of all of that, I write the blog Healing Whole. Before I begin this, I always like to tell people that what I say to you today could change if I give this talk in another 6 weeks, simply because as we learn more, we're constantly having to update our knowledge base. So with that in mind, let's talk about what's a pandemic, what's an epidemic. And I should also say that we're going to divide this into sections, and each section we do, if you have questions, there'll be time for you to ask those questions. And furthermore, we will, we do have this going on in YouTube, and if you're watching via YouTube, you can write your comments below, and Eric can certainly get them to me. And thank you, Eric, for your patience.
I wanted to say real quick, we also have Newt Rose from Black River, BRAM, right? Black River Academy Museum. So he'll have some things to share as well.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really looking forward, Newt, to hearing your presentation. So let's talk about what's an epidemic, what's a pandemic, and the real big difference is the P in pandemic. Think of it as passport. It's an epidemic that's really gone beyond a particular area. So for example, when this epidemic of COVID started, it was called an epidemic, and it was in Wuhan, and it was in China. And then as it progressed, it became a pandemic. Sometimes we use the term endemic, and that refers to when it's just in a very specific area. So for example, the Ebola virus is considered to be endemic to the Ebola region of Africa. Unfortunately, that is certainly progressing. So that will be a change. So why do we have epidemics and pandemics? Well, that goes back about 10, 12,000 years ago to when agriculture began. And you have all these different continents, and it evolved in different ways. In the Americas, there was very little domestication of animals. You had the dog, you had turkeys, but basically this was largely you hunt, you fished, but you were really, really exceptional farmers. And in fact, today, 60% of the world's foods actually originated in the Americas, which gives you some indication. And furthermore, the viability of these farmlands of these first peoples, many places it's still intact, particularly in South America, which just shows they really understood how to use the land. And the other part of the world, in Europe, in Asia, Africa, this was widespread domestication of animals. You had the sheep, you had horse, cattle, swine, so forth. As a result, in that part of the world, you see this interaction of these two, of the humans and these animal species, and you start seeing the birth of these pretty horrendous diseases. So for example, horsepox becomes smallpox. Consequently, in the Americas, while you might die from warfare, you might die from an accident or some diseases, you had, or sacrifice, human sacrifice was pretty big in some parts. You could live for quite a long time with a particular disease, so more like a chronic disease. In the other part of the world, in Asia, Africa, and in Europe, you were more likely to have an acute illness where you got ill and died rapidly. So you had smallpox or something of that sort. So in 1491, if you looked at North and South America, you would have seen very, very heavily populated. You would have seen very advanced cultures in certain places. You would have seen farming that wouldn't look to what you think is farming. There would not have been grasslands for grazing simply because there was no need for fences or pens because they weren't raising animals. But the land was heavily, heavily manipulated to meet the people that lived there. In Europe, it was very different. And suddenly now, in 1492, you have Columbus arriving, and this created something called, afterwards called the Columbian Exchange. It's a term coined by Alfred Crosby, a historian, and it's been picked up by Charles Mann, who has done a lot of work with this, who's written the books 1491 and 1493. The entire world changed. With his arrival, it didn't just bring a group of conquistadors. It brought disease, it brought new plants, it brought animals. We always think of they're coming in the horses, but they brought swine, and swine absolutely can transmit disease. In the Americas, while there was TB, there was syphilis, there was even Lyme disease, ticks carried Lyme disease. There was no measles, there was no smallpox, there was no colds, flus, the kinds of things that would take out bubonic plague, that would take out people quickly and rapidly, just didn't exist in the Americas. Some people call this virgin soil, and the idea is, okay, they came in, they didn't know the diseases were going to happen, whoops, it was not our fault. Initially, that's true, but by forcing the Indians into smaller and smaller living spaces, you started to see where disease really took on a different turn. And the result is within 150 years, up to 95% of the indigenous people of the Americas were gone. That's a pretty startling number. It wasn't just disease, but I think a large part of it, more of it was disease. There was a lot of warfare. Unfortunately, there was a lot of civil warfare where the conquistadors would pit one against the other. But germs were absolutely a devastating factor. Does anybody have any questions about any of that to this point? No questions? Okay, then we'll move on to the next section. And I have to check my notes. There are, as I worked on this, I came up with a common group of factors that happens wherever you have pandemics and epidemics. The first one is they will end. At some point, we will be done with COVID. It will stop. We will have figured out a way to deal with it. Great. But there will be another pandemic, another epidemic. Even though we all think of 1918 as the last time we had a giant pandemic, I can tell you, having worked in AIDS, it was an enormous epidemic, and I did work around the world in it, and I did see the devastation it did in many parts of the world. And it was pretty hellacious. But this is truly this is the largest pandemic we've had since the 1918 flu. The biggest, most common reaction when we have this type of an event is fear. And what happens when we're fearful? It's fight or flight, it's panic, and extreme cruelty happens because people are really interested in, how do I take care of me? So when the COVID epidemic started up here, what did we see? We saw people coming up from other parts of the country, Connecticut, New York, wherever. They wanted to make sure that they were in the safest place they could probably be. So they wanted to be in Vermont. And yes, you could get out and you could do things. And in truth, we've had a governor that has been so clear and so concise and his role model. I get it. But in a lot of ways, we're sort of in the 1%. We are in such an ideal situation to get through this pandemic. But in other parts of the country, it was a very, very different situation. It's been extremely challenging, extremely difficult for people. And then they start blaming. And we certainly saw this, and we still see this. I can tell you, I monitor the Cavendish Facebook page very closely. And the amount of anger at second homeowners and tourists, even today, is unbelievable. Even though the health department tells us again and again, that's not the case. This is how this is being transmitted. People absolutely want to believe that. And you see this in every pandemic. In the plague, the Jews were absolutely, they were burned, they were driven out, the ghettos were burned. They just wanted to believe that they were responsible for it. The Pope comes out and says, no, these people aren't responsible, but it didn't stop it. The fear that we attach to people that we think that may be part of that epidemic. So for example, working in AIDS, they called the 5 H's because the first group that came in with that epidemic were the Haitians. So it was the Haitians, the homosexuals, the heroin users, hemophiliacs. Anyone that got factor 8 during that time was pretty much guaranteed to get infected with HIV. And then they used hose for people that were sex workers, and they were positively shunned. When I worked in the hospital in Maryland, you would see people that you thought wouldn't be like that, like trays would be left outside, the person couldn't get up to go get the food. They may not eat for a day. This is in a hospital. Mortuaries would not take people with AIDS. There were literally times when people were left in alleys. It was pretty horrible what happened. So this is just standard what happens to groups that people that are on the fringes in any way are often the groups that are going to be the most impacted. So for example, when they had the big typhoid outbreaks, who were the two groups that really got impacted in the 1800s? It was the Indians and the Irish. Both groups were really marginalized. They were in conditions where there was poor water. And so it just spread like wildfire. It is not at all uncommon that you see civil unrest. Right now, we're seeing this all over the world. In India, the farmers are absolutely revolting. In the Netherlands, people are burning. This has been going on now for a week now with fires in the street and so forth. We've seen what's happened in our own country. In Russia, there's a full-scale riots going on. So yes, there is civil unrest. It is part of what happens, and in fact, there was a study, and I want to read this because I think that's going to make the most sense. This study came out in December, and it talks about, hold on a second. This was in the journal Peace Economics, Peace Science, and Public Policy. And it basically says that from the Black Death in the 1300s all the way through to the 1918 flu epidemic, all but 4 occasions where revolts happen were not clearly connected with the respective outbreaks. In short, whenever you have riots and revolts, they are almost always associated somehow or other with a major pandemic epidemic. And they note there is evidence to demonstrate that epidemics can disrupt civil society in 3 ways. Firstly, because policies to prevent the spread of disease can conflict with people's interests. Secondly, because the epidemic's impact on morality and economic welfare can worsen inequality. And finally, due to the psychological shock that can lead people to believe irrational narratives regarding the spread of disease, which may result in social, racial discrimination and xenophobia. In addition to civil unrest, you see that people want to take advantage of this situation. Right now, if you go online, did you know that you could buy vaccine to stop this? But this is what happens. People absolutely are looking out for their own interest in how they can make the most of things. My favorite is from the Antonine Plague, which dates back just about 2,000 years. This guy was a magician, and he used literally a hand puppet, a snake hand puppet. And he would sell a little icon that you could put over your door, and that's going to protect you from the Antonine Plague, which was probably smallpox. What happened? The people that had those little guys over their doors were more likely to die from it because they really believed it, and of course went about their business and more likely were to be infected. The bottom line is that the cruelty, and that was what Marcus Aurelius, who his whole reign, 15 years of his reign as Emperor of Rome, were dealing with this horrible plague. And he just said, it's bad enough that we have the disease, but it's the cruelty that people are doing to one another that he found most disturbing. And I can tell you that there are days I am just so shocked by the kinds of comments that people make. And I just think it's very hard for me to fathom why they do. But when you're really afraid, a lot of your filters are off, and you may not even realize what you're actually saying. Politics and pandemics have more than starting with P. You can't separate them. Politics are a huge, huge part of this. We see, like in the 1918 flu pandemic, Wilson does the Sedition Act. The papers are not to be writing about the flu. Every focus was to be on World War I. You see how in Vermont during that period, absolutely, they just didn't know what to talk about. They didn't know what to close down, how to close down. They were just so concerned about the war effort and the focus on the war effort. They were having a difficult challenge figuring out how to deal with this flu pandemic. So if you want the best example of politics, I would encourage you, and I can put these links on the Historical Society website if people are interested. The New Yorker did a article in their January 4th to January 11th. It's almost the entire issue on why America is in the situation that we are in right now with COVID, and it's pure politics. I mean, we're starting to see some of that with Fauci and Dr. Burke coming out and talking about their experiences being on the White House task force. It's really fascinating, but it's part of the deal. The health impacts on any of these pandemics, we're not going to know for years and maybe centuries. So for example, people that survived the Black Death, the plague, they passed on a gene that when the AIDS epidemic hit, their descendants who contracted HIV became what were called non-progressors. In other words, they got the virus, but it didn't do much to them, which we found really fascinating that it was linked back to the bubonic plague. We don't know what COVID is going to do. We're already seeing that there are people that are what are called long haulers. In other words, they get it and they don't really recover. They still have extreme fatigue, brain fog, and so forth. They now have all kinds of support groups going on. We knew early on from the neurology community that we would probably see more things like Parkinson's disease, and we in fact are seeing that because this virus can cross the blood-brain barrier. So we are really trying to stop this virus because we don't know what it'll do long haul. And maybe you get it today and it doesn't impact you for 30 or 40 years, which is the case. Like you get chickenpox and you don't develop shingles until you're much older. And that's been a real problem. So we don't know what that's going to do, but that's true for every single pandemic. We don't know what the long-term effects will be, and we won't know them for decades. The other thing that always happens is change absolutely follows. So for example, let's take the Black Death. Many historians say if they hadn't had the Black Death, you would never have had the Renaissance. You had a lot fewer people to feed and care for. You also saw that the serf class, they now could sort of say, no, we're not going to go back to those old terms you have, because there were too few people and they had to have people to do the work. Suddenly you start seeing the rise of the middle class. You also see greater literacy. There were tons of clothes around, and Barbara Tuchman talks about in A Distant Mirror. If you've never read it, it's an interesting book. Where with what are you going to do with all these clothes? Well, they could turn them into paper, and suddenly there was more books available for people to read, and people did take advantage of that. So there were huge changes. The AIDS epidemic absolutely changed healthcare in some of the most profound ways. People may not be aware, but a lot of the cancer research that followed came because of the bench research that was done in AIDS. The whole way we act with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and drugs coming out to being and using one drug for another purpose, all originated thanks to HIV and the efforts of the activists that worked on that. Things like the ribbon, we now think about the pink ribbon, the red ribbon, all of that, that all originated with AIDS, and the whole way that people went about raising money and advocating for their issues and really standing up and saying, no, we refuse to die, absolutely, completely changed everything. Similarly, when you see things like the 1918 flu pandemic, absolutely revolutionized public health. So are we better off after many of these events? We absolutely are. We will see major changes. Somebody today was talking to me about the post office, and should Cavendish and Proctorsville be united under one post office? And the thing that's so amazing about that is, obviously, we've seen huge changes in the post office because of the internet, and people don't write letters, because we email and we text and we do all these other things. People pay their bills online. The post office now, if you go into the Cavendish post office, it is just overflowing with packages because people are ordering. They don't want to go to stores, so they order. And that's much more now than it was pre-COVID. So, where are you going to have the space to put all these packages? Sort of says, gee, it's a different function now for the post office. There are some people that absolutely love working at home. They want to continue telecommuting. Some businesses are saying it's cheaper if we do that. We are just at the beginning of trying to understand the kinds of things that are going to be happening post-COVID. The one thing that we know is, boy, this whole mRNA research that's being done, that's the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, it's opening up a whole new area. We're going to see a lot more vaccines coming down the road, a lot more potential for a lot of different things. But the biggest thing that I do really want you to understand is that when you have these pandemics, and everywhere we look, oh, children are never going to be able to function again. They're going to have mental health issues forever and a day. The humans are wired for resiliency. We've been around for a long time, and our number one response, whether it is to extreme grief, war, pandemics, is always resiliency. We want to continue to thrive and survive, and we will. So hold on to that. It's wired into our DNA. We often talk about all the negative stuff that happens. And why do we do that? Because the negative stuff, that's, it's sort of like, this is what we hold on to, because that's what protected us for centuries on the plains of Africa. It helped us evolve. We needed to understand that that bad thing behind the bush may really be a bad thing behind the bush. So we're kind of Teflon for the good. In other words, we let the good stuff go, but the people are doing some incredibly wonderful work, not only helping to organize their communities, but the research that's happening is absolutely fascinating. So any questions about that? So let's move on to more closer to home and to to Vermont, and we'll set this up for 1918, and I'm going to turn over to Newt. Vermont was no strangers to pandemics. We certainly saw that with the Indians, the Abenaki were definitely decimated by this. Even before Champlain arrived, they would have been trading with other people. And again, the swine were like the biggest disease carriers. If you looked at when DeSoto landed in Florida, and he went from Florida to Texas over a period of 4 years. And he said, boy, everything was populated. There were tons of people, but he traveled with a herd of swine. Now, not only did they go in and wreck the agriculture that was set up by the First Peoples, but they carried disease. And so while, some of DeSoto's men at the beginning of the journey had smallpox, they certainly weren't going to be continuing dealing with that. But unfortunately, the swine would bring that. So when LaSalle comes through, he's like, there's nobody here. There's some bison and there are a few people, but these cities are gone. And you see forests growing up where before these were lands that were burned regularly and well maintained. So the same thing happened in Vermont. We see our first sort of pandemics that we really talk about was polio, believe it or not. Rutland, Vermont was the first place that really gave us polio, and that was in the late 1800s. And because of that, you see the rise of real public health here in Vermont. In my town of Cavendish in 1911, we had to cancel our 200th anniversary because we had an epidemic of smallpox. And this is really fascinating because we actually have been vaccinating people for centuries. The Chinese were doing this probably 2,000 years ago. They had figured out a way to do a type of vaccination. George Washington vaccinated the troops, but somehow or other in 1911 Vermont, they didn't vaccinate and there was an outbreak of smallpox. In 1917, there was a polio epidemic. And once again, you see this whole thing, oh, no, we don't want to do these activities. We don't want to quarantine, which was how they dealt with things. So that brings us up to 1918. And Newt, do you want to go ahead and talk about Ludlow? Do you want me to talk about where that came from?
Sure, you can sort of set it up and then I can give the specific examples of Ludlow if you'd like.
Great. So the flu of 1918, as I said, we talked about animals, birds, swine that can make an impact. And in Haskell, Kansas, you had big swine stockyards, and it was also a migratory path. And one of the theories is that these two converged, and you have this creation of what's now known as H1N1. This is also where you have an army barracks preparing to go to war. And suddenly you have this really horrible flu that's happening. And while the health of the doc there reported that, it didn't sort of make a lot of headlines. But now these troops are traveling across because they're going to go get onto ships and they're going to Europe. And along the way, people are starting to get sick. So in September, it's becoming very obvious that something is going on. And, is it going to get in the paper? What's going to be done? And so the governor and the health officer at the time, they're having a discussion. Well, do we say something? Don't we say something? How are we going to deal with this? And they ultimately decide, well, okay, we should tell people that a flu's coming. Well, the flu was already here by the time they put it in the paper. And it's in the same issue. We have this flu. The flu's coming according to the health department and the governor. But then we have soldiers and students that are already in barracks and they're really sick here. So Newt, why don't you talk about Ludlow and then I can talk about Cavendish for what I studied. So why don't you start, Newt?
Sure, yeah, thank you so much, Margaret. That was a really enlightening sort of a broad walk through all of pandemics and epidemics. My name is Newt Rose. I'm on the board of directors of the Black River Academy Museum, right next to Cavendish, but we preserve and present the history and the culture of the Ludlow area. And last spring, we really started thinking about the history of illness and pandemics, and specifically the 1918 flu in the Ludlow area. And to do that, we went back to looking at newspaper articles, specifically the Vermont Tribune. This is a newspaper, really a newspaper of record, kind of a go-to place for any sort of historical research. And what I want to do today was just share a few stories, just real nuggets that we can look at from a very local perspective of a community dealing with an epidemic, not unlike the communities that are dealing with it today. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see it? All right. So the first thing that I want to talk about was this, really, again, just a nugget of information that we can look to in the Vermont Tribune. This is from October 10th of 1918, really when things are first taking off in Vermont, or at least being recognized to be taking off. And this is a notice from the health officer, W.N. Bryant. He's also a practicing physician in Vermont. And at this point, it's really falling on him to provide any sort of leadership or guidance about the Spanish flu, or the 1918 pandemic that is coming, or that really is already there. But we can look at these words that he writes. And he says, regarding quarantine, there, in capital letters, is no quarantine at all. We are directing to placard houses where it exists with the name influenza, the same that we do for typhoid fever. We also ask that children keep from going from school and public gatherings for a week. This order was made not because we are getting a new type of disease, but because it is taking on epidemic form, and prevention is better than a cure. So I think this really speaks to the importance of communication, the importance of trust, responsibility of those in power. And specifically, we can look at those lines. This illness is taking an epidemic form, but also do the same as we do for typhoid. And I think it's important to remember, as sort of Margot set up, that disease was much more present in the early 20th century and in all of modern history. They had a precedent. It was part of, at least to some degree, sort of popular memory. They knew some sort of protocol of at least putting a placard outside your home. But again, prevention is better than a cure. That was sort of the message in October of 1918. We can also think about the response to this pandemic. And again, it's not unlike some of the responses that we're hearing today. This is from that same edition, and it's thanking, or it's asking people to make masks. It says, these masks are made of cheesecloth, folded in plates so that they are several thicknesses to thickness and tied with tapes at the back, being put on so as to cover the mouth and nose and lessen the danger of infection. So again, this is a very makeshift thing. It's made out of cheesecloth, but really capturing a local response and a community response. Incidentally, Springfield, Vermont was, at least initially, one of the most hard-hit places locally with this epidemic. And we do see a lot of aid, local aid, going to Springfield, Vermont. In another article, the Red Cross thanks several women from Ludlow, Mrs. M.A. Stearns, Marion Carter, Roxanne Sears, Florence Keating, and Ruth Raymond. These women volunteered to go assist in Springfield for a few days when sort of capacity was reached with all the institutions there. So we can see different local responses as well. And finally, we can think about some of the real local costs. This is a newspaper article from January of 1919, and announcing the death of John Townsend. And John Townsend, he was in Camp Green, Charlotte, North Carolina. And he was working with the medical department. He was essentially a healthcare provider. This is someone who had graduated from the Black River Academy in Ludlow. He had gone on to work, but was eventually drafted as part of that World War I, as part of World War I. And he would eventually contract Spanish flu and die working in the hospital at Camp Green. So there was these local connections, but also connected to World War I, to the larger epidemic around the country. And finally, there's this question of when does it end? I think a lot of people are asking that question today. I mean, how does COVID end? How does any pandemic end? And really, how does the story of it end? Margot nicely said that all pandemics do end, even if there will be another one. But it's interesting to compare the end of World War I to the end of the Spanish flu pandemic. We can look at the newspaper around Armistice Day and read accounts of how there was a hilarious, people were hilariously joyous. They were in the streets celebrating the end of World War I. Now, we can't really find an end date to the Spanish flu. I mean, you can't have an armistice with a virus or with any disease. But really the best we can do is really a very small note several months later, just saying the epidemic is quieting down. And I think that really sets up the difference between how people are reacting and how the stories of these are being told. And I think there's a big question of does history repeat itself? And I would answer that question by saying no, never exactly, but there always are patterns. As Margot said, there's always another illness, there's going to be another pandemic, and there's also human emotions, there's tragedy, but there's also always resilience, and there's always a relationship between our bodies, the environment, our health, our communities, and the structures that are already in place. But also, I don't think history has to repeat itself because there's always human agency. There's always decisions that have been made in these circumstances. People and these actors can adapt, can learn, can make changes, or on the other side could also do nothing. Even if you're not able to fight off a disease always, there are those larger structures that continue that story together. So I think the question we can also ask is what is required of individuals and communities now with an eye towards the past, but also looking towards the future. So with that, I'll turn it back to Margot.
It's fascinating. Oh, I'm muted. Am I back on? I live? Okay. What's really interesting is that in Cavendish, the worst of the flu really hit in 29. I mean, it hit in 1919. Out of our 4 soldiers that went to World War I, 3 of them died of flu. So, and that was pretty standard for that day and time, I think. But when I went through the death certificates. The one diary entry that I was able to find about that was from the Kingsbury family, and they were very clear that the food shortage was nothing in comparison to what they were dealing with in terms of flu. and the deaths that resulted. And I went back and I looked at 1917, 1918, 1919, and 1920. You can tell I went to grad school in epidemiology. I wanted to make sure I understood the trends. If I look at 1917, there were 27 deaths the entire year in Cavendish. 5 of those were flu deaths. And they ranged in age from 41 to 68. In 1918, we still see 27 deaths, but this time there's 6 of them are flu, but we see the youngest death is at 24, and it goes up to 60. However, in 1919, and we really see this between January and June, there are a total of 34 deaths for the year. 12 of them were flu-related deaths. And this is where you start seeing pregnant women. We had 2 pregnant women, one who just delivered. She delivered a stillborn child, and then the child died, and then she died. Other case where you see that this was a pregnant woman and she died. And that was the horror of this particular flu, because it really hit younger people. And so there were a number of orphan children as a result of this pandemic. It was 13% of Vermont was infected. So it was very, very devastating. And then 1920, you see this go back to only 5 flu deaths. Interestingly, in the Kingsbury Diary, she talks about how a member of the family gets the 1920, they get the flu, and it's very severe. It most likely was H1N1. H1N1 is still around. We still deal with that. But what I found fascinating is over the years of working for the Historical Society and talking to people about events they remembered, they would tell me about different things, but very few people, even though they knew about the 1918 flu, I'm sorry. Very few people talked about it. And I think that was because, let me get a drink here. I think the events that happened after that, with the Depression in 1930 and the war, it was just not a priority. And they dealt with more polio they dealt with more polio outbreaks, more flu outbreaks. We have not been tested as a society like we are being tested now since World War II. It is a real test of our country, how we're going to deal with this, and are dealing with it. Are there any questions? Eric, has anybody typed anything in? Is anybody on YouTube?
There are no questions on YouTube.
Okay. I think the big question in a lot of people's mind is, where do we go from here? And I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens. Right now, we're seeing this great response in Vermont of people getting registered for vaccinations. And truly, we're in a race. We're in a race to try and get people vaccinated before the flu, before these new variants can take hold. So we'll see. If there's, I'm really done with what I'm sorry, what I plan to present. I don't know if anybody has any questions or something else you'd want me to talk about.
Any questions? Okay, it looks like that's it. We'll wrap it up then. Any last words, Margot?
No, I don't have anything.
Any last words there, Newt?
No, just thank you, Margot, and the Cavendish Historical Society and Okemo Valley TV for making this happen.
Great. When this will appear on our website and on our YouTube channel and on the station soon. So thanks everybody for joining us, and I'm going to end it here. Take care.